The autumn sky hung over New York City. Tom Evans walked among the crowd, head bowed low, as if trying to disappear into the endless stream of people. He was carrying a cheap music case, his main treasure, which reminded him of the dreams he hadn't been able to fulfill yet. Tom lived in a tiny apartment on the third floor of an old building on the Lower East Side. Damp walls, a bare light bulb under the ceiling, and a window overlooking the wall of the neighboring building were his reality. There was barely enough money to pay the rent, and his job as a pianist at social events was more humiliating than satisfying. But Tom had a talent. He easily absorbed the manners of others, quickly adapted to circumstances, and understood human weaknesses. In a city where money decided everything, Tom was invisible. He was always chosen last, even when he was the best. The parties he worked at became a window into a life he had no access to. Women in gorgeous dresses and men in tuxedos talking about business, yachts, and traveling in Europe seemed to him like living icons of success. Tom carefully observed their gestures, memorized the intonations of their voices and the details of their clothes. He didn't just want to be one of them, he wanted to be better. One evening, at another party in a midtown mansion, Tom was performing his usual set of jazz standards. He tried not to look at the guests, but he couldn't help but overhear their conversations. His attention was drawn to a man in an expensive suit sitting in the center of the room. It was Herbert Green, the owner of a shipbuilding company, famous for his reserved but tough temperament. He spoke loudly, his words sounding like orders, even when he was joking. Toward the end of the party, Herbert stood up and approached the piano. "Beautiful music," he said, staring at Tom. "Are you a friend of my son, Richard? You look so much alike." He had once mentioned that he had a friend named Tom Evans. Tom froze. At first, he wanted to deny it, but then he remembered his constant failures and thought that this might be his chance. "Yes, of course we know each other," Tom answered uncertainly, quickly adjusting to the situation. This innocent lie opened a door he had never dreamed of opening. Herbert explained that his son, Richard Green, was in Italy and did not want to return home. He offered Tom a considerable reward for going abroad and convincing Richard to return to the United States. "You strike me as a smart young man," Herbert added. "I think you can get through to him." Tom smiled. His heart was pounding with excitement. It seemed to him that fate had finally decided to give him a chance. But somewhere in the back of his mind, amidst all the excitement and thrill, the first alarm bell rang. What exactly is he doing and where will it lead him? That night Tom returned home with the feeling that his life would change forever. The next day, Herbert paid for his tickets, provided him with the necessary documents, and even gave him some money to cover his expenses. And Tom set off on a boat trip across the Atlantic Ocean. The Italian coast looked like a postcard. The turquoise sea embraced golden beaches, and the rocky hills were dotted with brightly colored villas. Tom stood on the deck of the ferry approaching the small port of Amalfi, gazing at this fabulous place. His suitcase was modest, his suit was ordinary, but his heart was pounding in his chest with anticipation. It was a completely different world from the gray and cold New York he had left behind. Everything here seemed carefree, luxurious, and unattainably beautiful. Amalfi greeted Tom with streets that intertwined with each other like a labyrinth. The cobblestones shone under the sun, small cafes offered coolness under umbrellas, and the smell of the sea breeze mingled with the aromas of freshly baked pizza and lemon sorbet. Tom quickly realized that this world could be his world if he played his cards right. Richard Green lived in a luxurious villa on the coast. Tom found him on the terrace overlooking the sea. Richard was tall, tanned, and seemed to radiate a relaxed charisma. He was sitting in a lounge chair with a cocktail in his hand, and next to him was a girl in a light white dress. It was Margot Davis, a charming and playful American woman who was spending the summer here with Richard. "Tom Evans," Richard asked, lifting his sunglasses. "What are you doing here?" Tom smiled, as if they had more than a first-name connection, and politely explained that he had come at the request of Richard's father. From the very beginning, Tom could see that Richard was living the life he had only dreamed of. Expensive cigars, handmade watches, yachts, and endless parties. But this life didn't seem to burden him in the slightest, it just existed, as it should. Tom quickly became a part of Richard and Margot's life. In the evenings, they would drink wine on the terrace, laugh and play cards. During the day, they walked the beaches or went on a yacht to the neighboring islands. Tom, like a sponge, absorbed every detail. How Richard spoke, how he laughed, how he gestured, and tried to imitate him. At first, Richard thought Tom was interesting but a bit naive. He was amused by the enthusiasm with which Tom looked at expensive suits or listened to conversations about travel. Richard was a man who took everything from life and was not afraid to take risks. Tom admired his indifferent attitude to money, people, and even his own future. For him, Richard was the embodiment of what he had always wanted but could not achieve. Margot also took a liking to Tom. She laughed at his stories about New York and gave him advice on how to look more confident. For the first time, Tom felt not only accepted, but almost equal. However, the admiration gradually gave way to something else. Tom couldn't understand why Richard deserved this life. Why not him? He was smart, talented, and able to adapt to any situation. But Richard, who seemed indifferent to everything, had everything Tom could imagine. At one of the parties, when all the guests were laughing at Richard's latest joke, Tom felt bitterness brewing in his heart for the first time. Richard had been privileged since birth, and it seemed unfair. Tom began to notice how Richard made fun of his simplicity, how he talked casually about money that Tom didn't have, and how he easily brushed off any problems. Tom began to think about how things might have been different if this life had been his. What if he could have been Richard? It seemed that the whole world recognized Richard just because he was a green. And Tom, who learned to adapt, studied people and absorbed the best of their manners, remained invisible. This thought gradually began to turn into a plan. At the time, Tom did not know how far he would go. But one thing was clear. He could no longer stay in the shadows. He wanted more. He wanted everything. The sun stood high above the Italian coast, its rays mercilessly burning the deck of a small yacht that was slowly swaying on the waves. Tom and Richard were on another boat cruise, one of the many activities that had become an integral part of their lives. But this time the atmosphere was tense. Tom was sitting in the corner, silently staring at the horizon, while Richard, lounging on a sunbed, looked at him with a slight smile. In recent days, the relationship between Tom and Richard had become extremely tense. Tom was increasingly finding himself thinking that envy of Richard was consuming him. Richard, in turn, began to openly mock Tom, making him look like a substandard person. At one point, Richard sarcastically remarked, "Tom, you try so hard. It's funny how you want to be someone you're not meant to be." Tom was silent, but he was boiling inside. Richard's every word hit him right in the most sore spots, humiliating his aspirations and reminding him that he was an outsider in this world of luxury. When the yacht was far from shore, Richard decided to test Tom. He began to interrogate him as if in jest. "Tell me, Tom, have you ever thought about what it would be like to be me? To be the one who can afford everything? Maybe you would like that, but you will always be just a pale reflection of me." These words were the last straw. Tom broke down. There was a fire in his eyes that Richard had never seen before. "Have you ever thought, Richard, that you don't deserve what you have? That the people who are around you aren't there because you're great, but only because of your father's money?" Richard laughed. A rough, ruthless laugh. "Well, maybe, but what can you do? It's the way of the world, Tom. Some people are destined to be rich and some people are not." Their quarrel quickly turned physical. Tom, who had been restraining his feelings all his life, could no longer control himself. He grabbed a heavy metal fun pen that was lying nearby and began to threaten Richard. But instead of getting scared, Richard took a step closer, smiling. "What are you going to do, Tom? Are you going to kill me? Oh, that would be interesting. I can imagine how you'll explain it to Margot." Tom didn't answer. He could feel the rage taking over him. The next second was crucial. Richard rushed at him, and Tom instinctively swung. The metal blow stunned Richard, and he fell, his body frozen in motionless silence. Tom stood there gasping for air. The yacht was rocking. The sea around it was boundless and silent. The blow was fatal. Richard did not move. The blood slowly mixed with the seawater, flowing down to the edge of the deck. Panic gripped Tom. His mind quickly switched to survival. He took off Richard's watch, took his wallet and documents. After that, gathering all his strength, Tom tied Richard's body to an anchor and threw him into the water. The body sank to the bottom, and the waves covered all traces of the crime. Tom returned to the shore, carefully considering his next role. He decided to become Richard. He had enough talent and confidence to play this role. He could convince everyone that Richard was him. When Tom returned to the villa, Margot, who had been staying in her room all this time, asked where Tom was. "He decided to leave us to think about his life," Tom answered with a convincing smile. Margot, unsuspecting, took his words for the truth. Tom began to cautiously enter a new life. He was no longer just Tom Evans, he was now Richard Green, with all his money, status, and opportunities. But deep down, Tom felt that his crime was just the beginning of a big game in which the slightest mistake could cost him everything. Tom easily got into the role of Richard, but this role quickly became his prison. What at first seemed like a perfect life began to require constant vigilance. Every encounter, every conversation, every movement was now a performance in which the slightest mistake could expose him. Upon returning to the villa, Tom fully embraced the new image. He began wearing Richard's clothes, writing in his usual handwriting, and even imitating his mannerisms. The guests who came to the villa saw a confident and charismatic young man, just as Richard had always been. Tom did everything he could to ensure that, in their eyes, he remained the same playboy that everyone knew. He had to remember every detail of Richard's life: who he talked to, what he liked, what he avoided. Every new meeting was a test. Every question could be a trap. And although Tom was smart and talented, he began to feel the lie slowly strangling him. Margot didn't suspect anything at first, but then her behavior began to change. She noticed that Richard was different, more focused, more cautious than usual. She was also confused by the fact that Richard avoided talking about his plans for the future. She began to ask where he was and why he had suddenly decided to change his habits. "Richard, you look like you're under a lot of pressure," she said one evening when they were having dinner on the terrace. "No, Margot, everything's fine," Tom replied, trying to look casual. "I've just been thinking a lot lately. I want a change in my life." These words calmed her, but only for a short time. Her doubts remained. Tom realized that if Margot continued to ask questions, his lie might be revealed. The situation became even more complicated when Philip Carter, an old friend of Richard's, arrived in Amalfi. Philip was not only a close friend, but also a very observant and intelligent man. He immediately noticed that Richard was undergoing a strange change. Philip began to ask questions that made Tom worried. "You've changed a lot, my friend," Philip said one evening. "No, I'm not," Tom smiled nervously. "I just decided to take life a little more seriously." But Philip wasn't going to let it go. He started asking more questions about Richard's travels and his meetings with friends. In a few cases, Tom almost slipped up when he answered questions about past events in which he had not participated incorrectly. To maintain control of the situation, Tom began to avoid Philip, making up various reasons. But this only fueled his friend's suspicions. Philip began to ask Margot questions, and although she didn't want to believe it, she began to doubt it too. Tom realized that his situation was becoming increasingly difficult. Every day he spent as Richard became more and more difficult and stressful. He no longer enjoyed the luxury of his new life as he had before. Now it was all just a setup to cover his fear and paranoia. The lie he had so skillfully constructed was beginning to come apart at the seams. Margot, who had previously trusted Richard unconditionally, now looked at Tom very differently. Her suspicions grew with each passing day. She noticed little things. Richard no longer played the guitar he loved, his manuscript was different, and his favorite habits, such as his favorite coffee or the way he spoke, had changed. One evening, as they were having dinner on the terrace, Margot asked him cautiously, "Richard, what happened to that book you were reading last month? You always said it was your favorite." Tom, not expecting this question, froze. He tried to evade the question by mentioning the name of another book, but Margot knew that was not true. Her eyes grew cold, and in that moment Tom realized that she was beginning to realize that this was not the Richard she knew. Everything began to resemble a dangerous game of chess, where every move could be the last. Tom thought about how he could neutralize Philip, but fear and paranoia paralyzed him. He felt that everyone around him was beginning to see his true face. The turning point came when Philip found a few notes that Tom hadn't managed to destroy. These were Richard's notes that did not match what Tom had said about his travels and plans. Philip, having collected the evidence, began to openly suspect Tom. Tom realized that exposure was inevitable if he did not act. And now he was faced with a terrible question. Is he willing to commit another crime to keep his new life? Philip Carter had become Tom's main threat. He no longer hid his suspicions and began to openly ask uncomfortable questions. His curiosity turned into an investigation. He gathered several disturbing details: discrepancies in Tom's stories, inconsistencies in Richard's financial records, and most importantly, the fact that no one had seen Richard for several weeks. One day, while walking along the coast, Philip suddenly stopped and, looking directly at Tom, said, "Tom, or whoever you are, you know that I don't believe in all these coincidences. Where is Richard? And why are you acting like this is your life?" Tom felt his heart sink. He tried to keep his voice calm. "What do you mean? Why does it look like you're trying to be him?" This question made Tom feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Philip was not just guessing, he almost understood. The next day, Tom invited Philip to a reconciliatory conversation at a small restaurant by the sea. He offered to drink wine, hoping to convince him that it was all just a misunderstanding. But Philip was cautious and observant. "Tom, you're a good actor," he said, circling the glass with his finger. But even the best roles end at some point. Tom could not hold back any longer. He realized that it was only a matter of time before he was exposed. As they left the restaurant and headed for the waterfront, Tom pulled out the knife he had brought with him and seized the moment to attack Philip. As he struggled with Richard's friend, he whispered, "You don't understand. This is my life now. It's mine." Philip fell on the rocks, and the sea, which had seemed so calm before, now witnessed another crime. Returning to the villa, Tom felt that the burden of crime was becoming unbearable. Margot noticed that he had returned late and looked worried, but Tom managed to come up with another lie. But inside, he knew that the threads of lies were tangling him more and more. Margot, the police, Richard's friends, they would all start asking questions that he would not have answers to. Tom realized that his game was coming to an end. Richard's shadow, like Philip's, was now stalking him. Now every night spent in that luxurious bed was filled with nightmares. Rome, morning. The sun was rising over the eternal city, casting a golden light on the ancient streets and majestic squares. Tom was sitting on the edge of the bed. His body was motionless, and his thoughts were in turmoil. The mirror in front of him reflected the image of a man who looked confident and wealthy, but behind this mask was a deep anxiety. Tom seemed to have achieved everything he had always wanted: money, status, luxury. He wore Richard's suits, lived in his world, and enjoyed his privileges. But every minute he spent in this role felt more and more like torture. He was no longer who he wanted to be. One day, while eating dinner in a restaurant, Tom noticed two men watching him. He quickly finished his meal and returned to the villa, but panic was building inside him. He realized that the circle was closing. When he entered the house, he was greeted by a phone call. It was Detective Fernando Baldini, who was working on Richard's case. "Mr. Green, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your friend, Philip Carter," the detective said. Tom could barely keep from hanging up the phone. He had lied about Philip going to Florence, but he could hear the doubt in the detective's voice. His feeling that it could all end at any moment was now almost a certainty. Turning to the mirror, Tom stared at his reflection. It wasn't him, but it wasn't Richard either. It was something in between, a faceless actor stuck in someone else's role. He began to walk around like a caged lion, wondering if he could escape. But where to? What will he live off of if he leaves this life? Would he be able to return to the person he was after he had tasted luxury? His thoughts were interrupted by a message from Margot. She wrote that she was returning to Rome and wanted to meet up. Tom felt his heart skip a beat. She knew too much. Margot was his last link to Richard's past life. And Tom realized that if she started talking, it would be over. The evening meeting was the moment when all his lies could come crashing down. They met at the hotel. Margot looked tense and reserved. Her words were careful but direct. "Richard, or Tom, or whatever your name really is, I know something is wrong. You are not who you say you are." Tom tried to deny it, tried to convince her that it was all a fantasy, but her eyes radiated certainty. "Richard didn't just disappear," she continued. "And I can't keep quiet." Margot stood up to leave, but Tom stopped her. Margot, frightened and confused, decided to go to the police. He grabbed her arm, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. I just wanted a chance. I wanted to have something more than what I was doomed to. I didn't want it to go this far." "Then stop it, Tom," she said. "Tell the police. Maybe it's not too late." But for Tom, it was already too late. Panic flashed in his eyes. He realized he could not let her leave. When morning came, the room was quiet. Tom stood by the window, looking out at the square full of tourists. In the mirror behind him, there was nothing but an empty chair. He felt devastated. Tom realized that one day he would inevitably be found. But today he would put on the costume again, smile at people and play his part. He had become not only Richard's double, but a shadow of himself, doomed to run away from the truth forever.